My name's Whitney Schneidman. I'm a non-resident fellow here at Brookings, and thrilled to be here. You met Landry Signé, who is also the David Rubenstein Fellow, introduced earlier. And to Landry's left is Flory Lizer, President and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa, which is the largest trade association of U.S. and other companies investing in Africa. And formerly, before that, she was Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa. So we're thrilled to have you here, Flory.
Thank you.
Now, I'm told that Donald Kaberuka is on his way. So if he pops down from the sky or walks in the door, we'll just bring him into the conversation. But I think we should get going because there's a lot to discuss. And Flory, I'm going to start with you. Cool from the outset, I think, rightly sort of articulated the chaos that's going on in the global economy and the disruption of trade and the challenges to multilateralism. But as it concerns U.S.-Africa trade, I'm sensing a bit of a buzz. And I'm just wondering if you're feeling it too where you sit. And here's what I would point to. 2 weeks ago, there was in Washington the Africa Trade and Investment Global Summit, where more than 1,000 small and medium companies from the continent came to Washington in the Ronald Reagan Center. It was extraordinary, really, just looking for connectivity, looking for deals. The Commerce Department just finished a very successful 4-country trade mission to Africa: Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Ethiopia, where I gather they did about $1 billion worth of business. The BUILD Act is making its way through Congress, which will double the size of OPEC and allow for equity investments. Of course, the AGOA forum was this week. And just to throw some evidence into the case, U.S.-Africa trade was up 6% over last year to nearly $40 billion two-way. So just interested in your take, what you're hearing from companies both in the U.S. and Africa about the current trading environment.
So I think that's a good question. I think that when we look at the issue of trade generally, the reason that it becomes so critical both within the African regional context and in the global context is that trade has always been an engine for economic growth. It is the thing that pushes countries from a low level of development to a point where they're able to be more developed, to attract more investment, employ more people. And so Africa trading more with each other. I think they're now, it used to be 12%, but I think they're up to about 18% in terms of trade amongst themselves. And this is important because it means that they're becoming more competitive regionally, and that means that that's also going to be a platform for them to be competitive globally. In terms of U.S.-Africa, I think that whatever the sort of issues are that are out there on trade, that many American companies and many CCA members recognize that Africa is a really critical market for them. They are there because of all the opportunities in a range of sectors, from infrastructure to health to services sectors. This is critical for U.S. companies, and a lot of them will tell you that their bottom lines going forward and growing their companies depend on having a strategy in Africa. And they're competing with lots of companies from other countries around the world, not just China either. People focus on China all the time, but companies from Europe and Brazil, India, et cetera, Japan are all there pushing to make a way into that very important market. And that is one of the things CCA is always trying to work with its members and others to help them be competitive in that market. I think that it's also important when we're looking at Africa to see that they are also becoming more integrated. This comes to AGOA, becoming more integrated into global value chains. And I think that this is really critical because currently Africa still only accounts for about only 3% of all world trade. But if you look at particular sectors that have been growing in terms of their exports to the US market, you'll see that American companies are sourcing more from Africa: footwear, apparel, value-added agricultural products. And so, you know, if there is a buzz to be talked about, it's, I think, because trade is so critical to economic growth. There's more trade happening in Africa, and then there's more African trade, I think, happening now in terms of the US market, at least. A lot more that can be done. I don't think anybody wants to claim that the vision for AGOA has been fully realized, but I think that a lot of the conversation that happened this week was about that and how to go beyond AGOA in terms of enhancing the U.S.-Africa trade and investment relationship.
Right,
so
great.
We hear and feel the buzz.
Yeah, good. Well, before I get to AGOA, Landry, let me ask you, one of the conversations at the AGOA forum this week was the U.S. proposing a model free trade agreement with one country. And of course, Africa there as 49 signatories to the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And USTR made the point that, well, you know, Africa's not really in a position to negotiate a free trade agreement as one body. It's not organized that way. So we want to take this nation by nation approach. What do you say to the USTR argument that Africa is not organized enough to negotiate a free trade agreement with the US?
So that is a very good question. As presented by the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission, the African Continental Free Trade Area still need to come into force. So for that, we need about 22 countries to ratify it. So perhaps as of today, it is very difficult to negotiate, to have a negotiation between the United States and Africa from a continental perspective under the African Free Trade Area. However, for the post-2015 AGOA perspective, I think negotiations should start now. As you know, of course, the Deputy Chairperson didn't want to predict, but by 2030, Africa will have about 1.7 billion people. Mm-hmm. And by 2030, the continent will also have a combined consumer and business spending of about 6.7 trillion USD. So this is huge. And I believe that American corporations are also more likely to support a continental approach, and this for many reasons. This reduces the cost of doing business. You have a single market entry. It also facilitates transactions instead of entering in having multiple points of entry. A given company could easily access a broader market, among other advantages. And having also a continental perspective facilitates the development of infrastructure, which may not be profitable if only focusing on a single country. So I definitively think that although the continent may not have a continental partnership, which starts as of today under the African Continental Free Trade Area, however, the U.S. should move away from the bilateral or country-basis agreement toward a multilateral and continental perspective with Africa. Both sides will benefit from this type of approach.
But how does that happen? I mean, how does the U.S. engage Africa on a continental basis?
So we have an institution, the African Union, which is working, which has been efficient. So and which is supported by other African organizations, such as the African Development Bank among others. So one of the critical things to do is to create a council of high representatives from both sides to negotiate such type of framework. And even within African country, one of the policy options that I recommend is to create a president or prime minister advisory council, which will discuss and accelerate the implementation of all the trade-related questions, including the African Continental Free Trade Area and AGOA perspective. So it is not easy. It may take time. However, it is the best approach.
So, Flory, I don't think there's anybody in the U.S. as intimate with AGOA as you are. And I'm just curious how you think about between now and 2025. Because we know that in terms of getting legislation passed through Congress, 2025 will be here like tomorrow morning. Right. And if we're sort of not ready for a new trade framework, we'll be in disarray. Mm-hmm. And so just like in a perfect world, if you could advise the U.S. administration, if you could advise the African Union, what kind of vision would you put out that both sides should be looking for, mm-hmm. so that there's a smooth transition, mm-hmm. to a trade relationship that continues to take into account the developmental challenges from the continent, but moves to a more reciprocal-based agreement?
Right. So I think sort of two parts. The first part is there are 7 years remaining, a little more than 7 years remaining under AGOA. And one of the reasons why we pushed hard to have a 10-year extension was because we knew that indeed if buyers and those who are responsible for sourcing from all around the world, and we're looking at Africa, knew that they had a long period of time to benefit from AGOA, then the kind of investments that we were hoping would happen around the continent would indeed happen. And my understanding is that since 2015, there's been quite a bit of new investments into a number of African countries that are AGOA eligible. Ethiopia is certainly one. Kenya is seeing investment. Ghana is seeing investment. Last year, Ghana doubled the amount of apparel exports it sent to the U.S. So there is this remaining 7 years, and you are right, it will go by very quickly. But I do think that it also gives those AGOA-eligible countries that have done the homework, that have AGOA utilization plans. I'm always surprised to hear this, but only 15 out of the 40 AGOA-eligible countries have a plan for how to use it. But those who are ready, those who have looked in to see what they could sell in the U.S. market competitively, are beginning to do more of that. And I think buyers are also looking at Africa. Also, there are Asian manufacturers who are a part of key value chains who are shifting production from China as the labor rates go up to Africa. And we are seeing more of that happening. So I think there's that part of it, which is let's try to do all we can, put in place the kind of capacity building support on this side, and then the Africans on their side, supporting their entrepreneurs, small women businesses. This is really critical that everybody put in, all the effort that they can to make AGOA more successful and better utilized in the 7 years that remain. And of course, we don't know what Congress will do. Perhaps they'll extend it. Maybe they won't. If they do extend it, it may not apply to everyone who's eligible now. We just don't know what they'll do. I think the other piece of it, though, has to do with, while that's happening, what do we do to prepare for a potential post-AGOA relationship between the United States and Africa? And I think that's where it's going to be very important. I think, this is just my view of it. It is not possible to negotiate with 55 countries at one time, nor is it possible to wait until after the 55 countries of Africa have come together under the African Continental Free Trade Area. It is very important that we support it. So I'm not saying it's not critical, very important, and U.S. companies really want that to happen. commercially viable market coming together, offering them better opportunities than they have now. But in the interim, I see the potential for having some countries on the continent be sort of the champions in different regions, those who are more ready, who actually can see kind of a way forward beyond AGOA. And I think that if you have conversations that start with the Africans, maybe the African ambassadors here, I understand that that was something that was offered by the US government, that they would continue to have consultations here, but also, to reach out to the regional economic communities, to SACU, to EAC, East African Community, COMESA, et cetera, and start to have conversations. And you would look to the champions in each one of those. So if Kenya wants to be at the forefront in the EAC, so long as you don't leave the rest of the EAC out, let Kenya sit down and start to talk about it. And likewise in West Africa, East Africa, et cetera. I think that there are champions, and I think that the last thing I would say is that even amongst the Africans, if you listen to them, they recognize that there are some economies that are large enough that need to move forward.
Right.
And South Africa just signed on the other day, on July 1st, to the CFTA. And we heard just yesterday that President Buhari said that he would be signing for Nigeria. So the Africans themselves realize that, and you've got key countries, like the reason I'm mentioning this, South Africa and Nigeria, who I think recognize that they have to be a key part of it as well. Yeah.
So let me ask you one other question. Ambassador Lighthizer, during the AGOA forum, proposed a model FTA. And he said, we don't have a blueprint, but I think we know that FTAs are well blueprinted. There's not a lot of flex in there. Do you think it's possible to come up with a free trade arrangement, a free trade agreement, more specific to where African nations are, that Congress would support?
I really do think that that's possible. I think for two reasons. One, all of the free trade agreements that the U.S. has negotiated thus far, even when it does it with a group, there's always been some room and flexibility to treat different countries different ways. Maybe it's around the fact that they are a little less developed than the others. For example, in TPP, there were some things that people were willing to do with Vietnam that was a little bit different. Sometimes it's a recognition that an economy is small. CAFTA DR, the reason the DR got sort of pulled off was because they saw themselves as sort of the least developed in that group. And my understanding through the years of doing trade negotiations is that we're always willing to do some amount of flexibility, not necessarily to do something totally different,
right,
but some amount of flexibility. So I think on Africa, it would be interesting to see whether or not we could take some of the best sort of features that have come out of other negotiations for countries that are considered developing or less developed than the others, and see whether or not, from the very start, those might be more applicable to an African free trade arrangement. The last thing I would say, though, is that, and this came up this week during the AGOA forum, one of the reasons why the Africans were willing to negotiate the economic partnership agreements with the Europeans was because the Europeans linked to it technical support for trade and for the trade negotiations themselves. They said, okay, we will help build your capacity. And so the willingness of the Africans, a lot of them were reluctant, to be honest, but getting them to the table, a part of that was linking it to the support that they gave. And I just want to say, from my own personal perspective, that the United States has a lot of support that it gives to African countries. It's just done in lots of different silos of support. There are countries, billions of dollars that have gone under MCC compacts. There's the work that AID does. There's the regional trade and investment hubs. There's the work that USTDA does, et cetera, et cetera. But nobody packages that all up together. And today, from the perspective of companies, it would be great if we can go in and say, okay, we want to help you build this railroad or this bridge, or help you build, this hospital, or provide certain kind of new telecom services to you. And here's the deal that we're bringing to the table. You let this happen on your side, and from our side, we're going to have OPIC with us, we're going to have AID with us. If you've got an MCC compact, we're going to try to make sure that elements of it address kind of what your constraints and needs are. And I just think that a more, I guess you would call it, holistic approach to trade with the Africans that also pulls in the element of kind of where they are developmentally would probably be more well received by the Africans than just, let's just do a FTA and let's use the model that we've always had.
Yeah. Just to say, with all your examples, you make it sound like the U.S. is in the game in Africa in a way that it may not seem to be. But Landry, go ahead. You want to make a point?
Yes. I just want to discuss some aspect of what Flori has presented. My concern with adopting a country-focused FTA between the U.S. and African countries is power asymmetry. We have seen recently what happened in Rwanda, when Rwanda decided to ban import of second-hand clothes and shoes. So under this perspective, how will you envision a fair partnership? One of the advantages of having a continental free trade area on the continent in Africa is to prevent such type of asymmetrical relations, to make Africa be able to speak and to better negotiate agreement. But when we have the United States, the greatest power in the world, negotiating with some of these small African countries, I'm quite concerned that even despite the goodwill, the outcome is likely to not be optimal for both sides.
Yeah.
So how do you?
Landry, let me just jump in here, because I think we've seen situations where there have been pretty intense disputes that have been resolved, certainly vis-a-vis South Africa and chicken parts. And the dispute over secondhand clothing wasn't resolved with Rwanda, but it was with Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda. So, but I think to your point,
it was not resolved. They had to give up. You just have to say, okay, we will not be, we will not be fighting the U.S. You are not strong enough. We will just have to accept the conditions that you are imposing to us.
Right, but I think you raise a good point about the need for dispute mechanism.
Yes.
Dispute resolution mechanism.
Yes, and that is definitely a great point, because the other interest of having a continental free trade area is the future dispute resolution mechanism, which will be put in place, and it is critical because first, we don't have a clear most of the African countries do not even have the resources to pay for a lawyer to represent them. They don't have the resources. So that's why out of all the disputes globally, African countries are almost not represented, perhaps South Africa and a few other countries. But most of the African countries, when there is a challenge, they rather give up instead of going through a dispute resolution mechanism, through a formal process, because they just don't have the resources. So, and for this reason, I believe that it's very important to have a continental approach, because then the African Union or other sub-regional economic communities will be able to eventually join efforts in addressing such concerns.
Yeah. So before we open up,
if I could just one quick point, because I think everybody knows I'm a huge supporter of Africa's regional integration and also its integration into the global economy. But I do think that, I wrote down your words, I like that, the power asymmetry. Power asymmetry is something that happens even on the continent, okay? Mm-hmm. And it happens in almost every set of negotiations, whether it's with your neighbor to the north, Canada, or, a neighbor to the south, Mexico. In East Africa, everybody sees Kenya as the 800-pound gorilla in that region. Nigeria and ECOWAS is viewed a particular way. South Africa tends to be viewed a particular way across the continent in terms of how it engages with others. And I only mention that to say that it doesn't prevent, even when there is power asymmetry, it doesn't prevent countries from being able to sit down and negotiate ways that are mutually beneficial. I think the key becomes, can we find, if you're big and I'm small, you're medium-sized and the other guy is, micro-sized, can we find ways that are mutually beneficial for our businesses and our people? And I would just posit that with any country that we want to sit down with, we can find some ways to make it mutually beneficial. And I want to mention one example in terms of Rwanda, because I've visited factories in Rwanda. I went to see where the women were making the Kate Spade bags. I know what Rwanda can do, and they are definitely a leader in a number of areas there. But recently, and this is something that we should think about, recently Volkswagen of South Africa invested in building cars in Rwanda that will be shipped from Rwanda to South Africa and the region. Now, those cars are not yet headed to the US market, but right now under AGOA, Rwanda could be shipping automobiles to the US, and I am absolutely confident that those automobiles and the jobs they've created are more than the jobs that are involved in secondhand clothing. So I vote for that, frankly. And that's not to say we don't want to see their textiles and apparel coming into the US, but I think that is a sign of the kind of integration that's going on in Africa. And AGOA, last point I'll make, AGOA was made, we weren't thinking about it like completely in the context of how things work today. We were thinking about Africa benefiting from making the final products that get shipped to the United States. So it had to be assembled in Africa. But think about if, the car seats that I saw at a factory in Lesotho that were being shipped to South Africa for their autos that were being shipped to the US under AGOA. Those car seats, those leather car seats, don't count as AGOA trade, but they are really AGOA trade. They go into a product that's coming into the US. So imagine in Africa where you get these regional value chains and the final product comes from one place, but you have 3, 4 other African countries that are providing the intermediary products to that one country that then ships it to US, EU, Brazil, India, wherever. That's what I'm talking about for Africa. So that's my final point.
That sounds good. So let me just open it up on that note for some inputs from the audience. Let me start in the back there. Maybe we'll take a couple questions at a time. Please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is H.E, and I own AfriCorp International. My question to everyone inside this room is about visas among ourselves. I'm a Nigerian. I happened to school in Ghana, and it was very easy for me to do a road trip just to go to school. Now, at the middle of the night, sometimes I do road trips at night because I just want to get to Nigeria in the morning. So there are lots of women with their babies that go to buy products from other countries like Burkina Faso, and I meet them overnight at the borders trying to get visas when we can't. The business is 18%. It can get to 100% among ourselves if we can make it easy for each other. And the second thing is, to my diaspora brothers, the door is open for everyone to do business. Everyone can easily get a visa and buy a plane ticket to come down there. Thank you.
Yeah, great. There's a hand in the way back. Sir.
My name is Mutale Chilangwa. I work with AECOM. I've done USAID-funded trade projects for the past 18 years, and I'm sorry to say, but I'm very, very pessimistic with this whole Continental Africa Trade Agreement. Just based on my experience in working on the West Africa Trade Hub, Southern Africa Trade Hub, where ECOWAS, SADC, and even on the East Africa EAC, where there's all these regional integration bodies, EAC, ECOWAS, and SADC, and a lot of them are really stuck. So if they can't even move forward at the regional basis, I'm just very pessimistic how we can negotiate a continental trade agreement with 55 different countries.
Okay, point taken. And ma'am.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Seguero's International Group. Mr. Snyder, Brazil, I think you've been there for AGOA. You've heard about AGOA. Now that African Continental is coming, agreement, what about if AGOA fails today? I believe if African Continental signed this agreement and they can sign up with the USA, then AGOA, who is going to advocate for AGOA? We have fought for AGOA from the beginning to the end, extension. So we will be doing the same. 7 years is like 2 years now. People exporting now, teaching people how to export. I believe that African Continental should work hard to unite so that it signs up an agreement with the USA country as a vessel. We have African Union there, we have African there. But what we are doing with AGOA, I don't see it working as much as we had the party this week. So let's work with African Continental agreement and make African grow and be great again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's just respond to those. Maybe I'll respond first. Ma'am, I agree with you completely. I mean, Africa today in 2018 is very different than when AGOA was passed in 2000. Just the metrics are very different, and I think we need to move to a more reciprocal relationship in the context of AGOA, but one that also supports the integration of the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And that's not going to be easy. I sort of subscribe to what Landry was saying. We need to take time and really look at this. We need to appoint a high-level panel that hears from government, that hears from the private sector, that hears from civil society, that hears from different interest groups, women and others, so that we can move forward with a strategy that accelerates economic development on the continent and certainly leverages the role of the private sector. I don't think we have the blueprint yet, but I'm certainly one that we have to start looking beyond 2025 to a different kind of relationship, and the time to start that is now. Mm-hmm. So I'll go to my fellow panelists. 2 other questions were put on the table, one about visas, and the other was a pessimistic note from the back about, can this really be done? So Landry, why don't you take the first bite?
So it is a legitimate concern. I think I asked the same questions to the Deputy Chairperson. And I have to give to speak with Whitney. That was on Monday, preparing the senior civil servant from Africa and the ministerial committees addressing on various issues related to AGOA. My point was the following one. The world is watching. You have to be accountable. You have to succeed. You have no other options. And that is why I asked the question to the Deputy Chairperson. So it's extremely important. Yes, there are reasons to be concerned because in the past we have seen many initiatives which were not optimal. But I believe that a continental initiative is more likely to succeed than a sub-regional one or than the regional economic communities for many reasons. First, of course, we also see that at the continental level, but at the regional economic communities level, we have competition between countries. Some work better than others, and the market is still small. Let's speak about Central Africa. When you put the countries from CEMAC together, the is barely 50 million people. So it's still not significant enough to unlock the business potential. However, I believe that despite challenges, it is critical to look at the elements which can help succeed. And let me explain a few of them. So one of the point or the importance of it, the first one is the fact that when Africa trade with the rest of the world, they mostly export raw materials. But when trading between African countries, over 40% of the products are manufactured.
Exactly.
So this is extremely important, which means that by trading between African countries, and AGOA has also contributed, and I think as well illustrated by Flory, by trading between African countries, we create jobs. As you know, about 70% of the African population is below the age of 30. 70% of them live below poverty line, and their young people are twice as likely to be unemployed than the current generation of working people. So do we have challenges? Yes. Should they be addressed? It is extremely important in order to give Africa a real shot to compete globally. And my last point, even if Africa trade between different African countries trade with each other, it is only about 3% of the world trade. So Africa should also trade with the rest of the world, with the United States, with the European Union, China, name them. So it's extremely important to make this being successful.
Yeah, great. Flory,
I was thinking that, sort of in context, the Africans have been putting in place some of the building blocks for the African Continental Free Trade Area for a while. And, perhaps in fairness, we could say that those earlier attempts, the EAC has twice done sort of a free trade area. Now they're at a customs union this second time around, and really have made a lot of progress. And the point that Landry made about 40% of intra-African trade being manufactured goods actually says that as Africa trades more with each other, and these regimes, I know the gentleman back there was pessimistic, but as these regimes, the EAC, COMESA, ECOWAS, CMAC, et cetera, SACU, become more integrated among themselves, they're also becoming more competitive. And I think the way that this will work is that will provide the platform on which they can then be more competitive globally. So if they can ship manufactured products to each other now what they have to do is to be able to kind of take it to the next level and to be able to meet the standards that the global economy is looking for. If they can do that, then I think they will indeed capture more of the global trade. But it will happen not just because of commodities, it will happen because of value-added products, light manufacturing, et cetera. And you're seeing it, it's happening all across the continent. I've been to factories that are producing
just
things.
a couple examples.
Well, so the factory I told you about in Lesotho producing leather seats, there were probably 600 workers in that factory. I didn't even know there was such a factory. I didn't visit it myself, but there's a factory in Botswana that's creating, it's some sort of it's like an arm of a piece that goes into the car, right? I don't know much about cars, but it's another input into automobiles. They have a factory that's doing that as well and being integrated in. You see, Dangote Industries is producing cement. I've been to factories that are producing value-added agricultural products, pepper sauces, fruit juices, dried fruits. I went when I was just last week in Côte d'Ivoire. Somebody said to me, there's a cashew processing plant that just opened up 3 months ago that will be producing more cashews than all of the cashew plants in Côte d'Ivoire presently. So I went, and I don't have my iPad with me. Incredible. They had the best machinery that separates out the different cashews from sizes and colors and this and that. And they were only at one line. They're built to do 4 lines. I saw mostly women working in there. So, to that point, I'm just saying that it is happening. Africa's industrialization process is happening. And is it where we want it to be? No. Is there much more potential? Absolutely. But I think that, if you don't see it, and the numbers are so small that you think it's not actually happening. But I want to assure all of you that Africa actually is becoming more integrated, is becoming more industrialized, and more people are benefiting from trade in Africa, which, as I started out earlier saying, is the key to economic development. So that's my, I'm a real optimist about Africa.
Okay,
so.
we got time just for a couple more questions. Please keep it brief, sir. Just so we get a couple of
Gustavo Vela with the Committee for Free and Democratic Equatorial Guinea. I want to applaud you for the new leadership, the Corporate Council on Africa. With regard to power asymmetry, Equatorial Guinea negotiated its contract with ExxonMobil. The people, the oil companies came in with Harvard, Yale educated.
Question?
The people from Equatorial Guinea were guys who had 8th grade educations. Okay. That's usually the dynamic. How do we create more of a more equitable structure in negotiations? Because we know national security interests is just basically a code for what you have something that we want.
60 seconds. Question?
Hi, I'm Brian Stout with Foreign Policy Magazine. As the African Union takes its first big step toward economic integration, how much longer does it make sense to continue to negotiate with the EU as a member of the Africa, Pacific, Caribbean group under the Cotonou framework, which is up for renegotiation in 2020?
Okay. And let me, sir.
Thank you.
Guy Nzeribe, policy analyst in private practice. I'm Nigerian. I find the whole talk about CFT and AGOA very interesting. Only, as the gentleman before, I don't know what we want to do with that because we live here and now, and lives need to be changed. If we're going to believe that all the CFT business and AGOA, it takes an evolutionary, it's of an evolutionary nature that is going to take us another 50 years or 100 years to get there. We don't manufacture as much in Africa that we're going to become real trade partners, in discussion with other trading blocs. My point is, we have already things that work in Africa at the moment. Finance and technology.
Please, question.
That's the question. Why don't we stress those points? Finance and technology. Equity firms are rushing into Nigeria, into South Africa.
Okay.
They're making profits of 60% a year. We have, again, technology where there's trade there is really exchange between African countries, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa. Why don't we push those aspects?
Okay, good question. So Mr. Kabaruka has just come. Are you sure? Would you like just to come up and...
Yeah, just one. Yes, please.
Sure, please, please. Yeah, come on up. I've got a question.
Well, then ask him a question.
Yeah.
He'll answer.
Okay, so anyway, we're almost out of time. And let me ask you to respond to some of these questions here. We had about the power asymmetry, the role of the EU in Africa, and this question about regional integration in the financial sector.
Yes. The question of power asymmetry, I think I discussed that during the session with Whitney, and I will let Flory elaborate more on it because I know she's a great friend of Africa and she has been working hard to make policies fairer. However, it is not easy. So the European Union, ACP, I think they are putting the US in disadvantage because a privilege agreement between African countries and the European Union is not in the best interest of American corporations. So that's why Whitney and myself and I have published a note last Friday where we're discussing some of these questions. So it's on the Africa Growth Initiative website, so you can look at it for more elaboration. But the idea is a reciprocal partnership between Africa and the United States is more likely to be of advantage for Africa because it also gives a leverage. In the case of AGOA, the USA is offering a lot of things to Africa, but Africa doesn't have a room for maneuver in case of disagreement. Not a lot, perhaps a tiny one. However, when a partnership is reciprocal, there is possibility to react if there is a disagreement, and adding to that the fact that if it is at a continental level, we also have a dispute resolution mechanism which will facilitate the negotiation.
Flora, do you want to take on any of those issues, particularly about the EU? I think you're well positioned.
Yeah, I think that there's been a long history, obviously, of Africa's engagement with the EU. And I think that the frameworks that they put in place, I remember when there was the announcement in, I want to say it was in the early 1990s that they were going to negotiate these economic partnership arrangements. And every time it got close to the end of the time frame when it was supposed to have happened, then they extended it further. And I think that that was a reflection of the fact that the Africans were reluctant. I think it was a reflection of how difficult it is to try to transition a relationship from one that's been economic dependence to one that's more interdependent and mutually beneficial. And I think that the Africans are in a very different place now. That's my personal view. They've gone through different sets of these negotiations. I know, for example, SACU has negotiated twice with the EU and have an updated trade agreement with the EU. I know that they have one with Mercosur. They're looking at doing one with China. I remember talking with some of the East African community colleagues who were going back and forth to Brussels for theirs and really beginning to get a sense of kind of what it takes to be at the table across from the EU. Now, does that mean you get everything that you want? Of course not. No one in a trade negotiation gets everything they want. But I think the Africans are more ready now to do that. And I remember leading from the U.S. side, the U.S. SACU free trade talks from 2003 to 2006. A lot of people don't know, but we made a lot of progress. We really did. And, we had several chapters that had gotten fairly close to the end. Let me end my point about why it's important for the Africans to move to another level, which is similar to what I think you all are saying, though I haven't read your piece yet. Any relationship where you're dependent on the other person to give you something unilaterally, right, and where every year you have to earn it again and again and again, I think most of the African countries under AGOA have remained eligible the entire time. So there have been a few countries here and there who've lost eligibility and come back in as eligible, Madagascar, Cote d'Ivoire. So it's not like every year somebody's getting kicked out. But the point is that every year there is an annual review. And now under the 2015 legislation, you have industries that can also file petitions and ask for out-of-cycle reviews. That's how the whole thing happened with Rwanda. So my view is this, that, Africa has grown up. They're not, little kids on the block anymore. They've got some more experience. They've got good leadership in a lot of countries, AU leadership, new leadership in a number of countries. We're seeing incredible things happening in, Ethiopia, et cetera. And so what I would say is, I'm just going to use one example. South Africa, I was looking at this recently and it was amazing to me. 41% of South Africa's products that they export to the US come in duty-free, either under GSP or AGOA. And the US is their #2 market in the world. So here's what I would be, if I were advising the South Africans and I had 41% of my exports to my #2 market that was dependent on a unilateral program, I'd be at the front of the line to negotiate a two-way agreement where I'm an equal at the table with you and where I can decide what I want to negotiate that's best for my people and all those workers in South Africa who are linked to those 41% of their exports. They exported over $1 billion in automobiles to the US last year, just autos. Then you look at all the other products that they export. So here's my point. Africa is more mature. They need to be able to have more mature relationships with all their partners, whether it's the EU, China, India, because there's some things they need to fix with China too, in my opinion. But why not have a relationship with the US that is one where they are equals at the table and get to decide what's best for them and work that out. And I would recommend it, and I wouldn't wait until the last minute before AGOA expires in 2025, because what if Congress doesn't extend it again?
Right.
What if the US Congress decides they don't want to do it anymore? And then what would you do? Even if 5% of your exports to US depend on it. But that's my suggestion. Africa is ready, they can do it.
And we've made a lot of progress here this afternoon, too. And unfortunately, much more to discuss, but we've run out of time. So just please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.